Chapter 53.
I could lie to you, but, truth be told, I haven't seen them for some time. I dare say they have abandoned me, damnable fools.
After a few days spent resting and recovering, Leopold had felt significantly better, although the conversation had quickly turned to curiosities from his companions. Neither seemed willing to accept that the strange, lumpen white creatures that seemed to form and appear around him were gone entirely, but so it seemed. He had been quite alone, after all, that much was certain. But, despite the snippy tone and freshly buffed coat of his jacket, Leopold couldn't hide just a hint of his good mood, and if he were a tad kinder to the demon and the harpy, well, it was probably another of fortune's little caprices, and nothing more. Crimsolino was circling lazily in the sky above, coasting on thermals and enjoying the mild, beautiful weather, and he could not blame her, for the reality of it was that it reminded him much of the weather back home. Not truly, of course, but what he wanted it to be, what he remembered it as.
Is it nice to fly?
Mr. Mammon snickered a little at his side, but of course a merchant couldn't appreciate the finer points of questions, meaninglessly asked on a pleasant and pointless day. Above them, Crimsolino pulled sharply through the yawning blue expanse and fluttered before them, a very wry expression gracing her eyes.
Perhaps you took even more of a beating than I thought, sweet Leopold. Of course it is. One should not grow too used to it, though. To be honest, I often dream of the day I shall be able to put it aside entirely. But, it is enjoyable, for what it is. The sky is a pleasant sea.
They had left the rest area after the rain had let up, and stuck to the roads that someone, or some group had likely built recently. It amused Leopold to no end that the one lasting consequence of his work on the island was, perhaps, bringing its inhabitants into a place they could work together.
Crim. I don't think you should think too much like that. Of course you would say that, dear Mammon, but I shall eventually return to my legendary and astounding beauty, as I am sure you well know.
Leopold hadn't taken the time to truly watch the two before, to get to know them. He had stared and listened and looked for points of attack and little weaknesses to exploit, but that was different than really listening, than really trying to understand what was going on in the heads of his friends. Just being silent for a while, it felt pleasant. He had no great goal, no expectation, and their bickering was, they truly were good friends, weren't they? Wondering if he had ever truly known anyone he could trust so freely, Leopold braced himself against his cane. Its weight was a constant relief, when his mind was untethered like this.
Yeah, but... Crim. Look at like this, if you do, great. If you don't, well... You've adapted to it. And I mean, you're already striking as it is. No need to go causing the rest of the world to tear out their hair cause they'll never match the heights of your beauty. You're really making fun of me, aren't you?
Well, he still had a few plans, of course. There were ways to turn this situation to his advantage, even now, but they all seemed so ephemeral and unobtainable. Chase Dragunov down, and beg for a fraction of that power? He had no plans to be burnt into ashes of atoms, or however that might go.
Nah, never. Leo. I'm not making fun of Crim, am I? Just trying to teach her an important lesson about life, loss, and acceptance. That she'd never learn without the sage advice of a friendly local peddler type. Right.
Shaking from his musings, Leopold chortled and shot the demon merchant a tight-lipped smile.
You're doing decently enough, Mammon, but I'm afraid the only life lessons you have to teach impoverish the soul. How is that, then?
Crimsolino cooed in unhidden laughter, but Leopold felt fairly certain it wasn't at his pun. Mammon shrugged it off as if it were water, shaking his head as if Leopold were some unschooled pupil, instead of an old man.
What can I say, Chief? You win some, you lose some. Tell you what, you stick to making the schemes and I'll stick to following along from a cautious distance. It's kind of my deal.
Perhaps demons were just more friendly and hopeful, by nature, than humans. Somehow, that reassured him, just a little. The distant sound of birdsong was pleasant and soporific, and as he scratched the side of his cheek.
"Ah, you know. Perhaps we could just spend today fishing, or something like that."
His eyes at the branches of nearby trees, Leopold didn't see the glance that his companions exchanged, and Mammon was too quick to respond for him to make anything of it.
"Kinda fished out over here, boss. Can't say I'm one for really waiting around, you know." "Well, I am, but only in small doses. Gotta mix it up now and again." "You certainly do, don't you?"
It wasn't long after that he had insisted they stalk through the thin, reed-like grass that grew at the edge of the forest. It wasn't particularly rich or tall, and if he had been more inclined to a blade, Leopold felt the blades might make for a good flute. But that's not what they were looking for, however.
"Truly, sweet Leopold, and now we're reduced to rooting around in the soil like common vagabonds. I know you must have been reduced to truly desperate means to survive in our absence, but... Actually, if you would do me a great favor, could you look for anything that we stir up? There's no reason to it. I'm just curious, I suppose."
Crimsolino shot Mr. Mammon another bemused glance, happy as she was to have found Leopold again, and certainly confused, but pleasantly surprised by his reaction. She was not so sentimental as to be foolish. The old man and his moods were mercurial, and shifted more quickly than a plotting usurper scheming some villainous skullduggery, or perhaps just as much, for she also realized it had been quite some time since she had seen that, as well. Resting against a large branch that had been bleached bone-white by time or whatever strange tree diseases cursed this part of the island, for Crimsolino was not, by nature an agriculturist, the Duchess fanned herself lazily with one red wing, and watched the two forms of Leopold and Mr. Mammon, so far below. Mammon, of course, dearest Mammon, had no clue what he was doing or looking for, but seemed content just to play along and enjoy the presence of a Leopold not intent on wringing service out of them for his own ends. To her, he was just a tiny blur of purple and the red of his cap, occasionally stopping to excitedly wave, either at her or just in general. Leopold turned and murmured something, and her hearing was sharp, because she had trained it to be, and Crimsolino's talons dug into the bark below. But the old man wasn't whispering some dire plan, he was just laughing. Laughing so hard it looked like he might cry. And he was smiling, as well. It was the strangest thing she had seen recently, and truly the years here had shown her more peculiarity than she had cared to admit. But, it wasn't unwelcome, either. And, foolishly or no, Crimsolino allowed herself to relax, if only a bit. Down on the ground below, Leopold had swung his cane to clear the area, reed grass bent in every direction, splayed but unbroken. Mammon figured that Leo looked a little annoyed that whatever he was searching for wasn't present, but...
You know, in my mind's eye, we'd find a few caterpillars, at least. I had this rather large discourse planned. Things never work out, do they, Mammon? No comment. No, wait, scratch that. I think things just work out in a different direction than we expect. All the time. It can be pretty draining but,
Mammon, who had also lined up a speech of his own, possibly with a few questions about how old Leo was holding up, headwise, went completely silent as a light breeze rustled the reeds around them. The old man had went silent too, because with the susurration of the rising wind, the air felt so brittle that to say something would have shattered it into shards. Around them, the reeds shifted back to where Leopold had pushed them to the side. Shivered and kicked prisms of dew to the ground. And spread wings with a faint, indescribable color before rising towards the sun. When the measured beating of tiny wings had finally come to an end, Mammon tried to find something to say, but nothing came to mind. It didn't seem to matter, though. There were plenty of times when it was fine to say nothing at all. Leopold was clutching onto his cane with an even, content smile. Occasionally, it looked as if he was fighting the urge to laugh from creeping past his beard, but...
Do you know, I think I'm quite blind. Could have fooled me, boss. Your hindsight is killer.
That at least managed to get a displeased, but amused, and further displeased that he was amused in the first place, chuckle out of his companion, as Crimsolino fluttered back towards them. Having followed the vanishing insects for a while, before leaving them to their sojourn.
Yes, well, benefit of being as wise and educated as I am, I suppose. I meant more. You know. The forest, the trees. Missing something that's right in front of you. Ah, but Leopold, sweet, sweet Leopold. That's what life is. One of the finest ways to appreciate something is realize how different your life is with it at arm's length. Friendship, wealth. Even beauty, at least in most cases.
Her laughter was good-natured as any birdsong, even if it wasn't entirely humorous, but it was hard not to find some peace in the moment. Perhaps, Leopold mused, perhaps all matters could be resolved by watching the flight of insects into the lazy wines.
Cry-eem. Gonna have to dispute you, there. Wealth doesn't fade, and true beauty is timeless. Sure, friendship can fade, but it can also come back when you least expect it. Like a boomerang. A boomerang of friendship. I wasn't trying to imply that everything decays all the time. Don't make me cross with you, dear Mammon, I haven't burnt anything at all recently and maybe I'll set your cap on fire. The whole world shall see your forehead and tremble. No. Not that. Wait, why is that a problem? I wash my hair once in a while, like when it rains.
Crimsolino laughed enigmatically, and Mammon shrugged. Birds were strange, especially when they also had all the mannerisms of duchesses, most courtly in all things.
Do you think when the time is up for me here, I'll die?
Mammon half-gagged on his laughter, but somehow wasn't able to stop. The result was an odd, half-croaking noise midway between a cackle and gasp that sounded like neither. Strangely, Leopold didn't seem bothered, either by Mammon's uncertainty, or his own peculiar question.
Well, no. You'll die when you die. That's how it usually works.
But Crimsolino said nothing, and her eyes lidded with the look she gained when deep in thought, the fire within her irises much more piercing than that with which she lit up the sky around them.
It's possible, I think. I wouldn't count on it, but there's certainly a ponderousness in the air, isn't there? And though I don't know the details of it, I've enough experience with magic to know that when you snap reality, it snaps back.
Crimsolino snorted, as if to imply that magic was a terrible thing, but of course, she was biased in the matter. As was he. Sighing, Leopold ran his fingers over his hair, and realized with wonder how dry the strands were, how wispy and unreal they felt. He was in good shape, good condition, even after he had spent time recovering. He did not feel like a weak man, not yet crippled by age and by infirmity, and yet.
That's not really it. I guess, I've been forced to confront a lot of things, recently. Do you recall when first we set about this journey, that manor house we found and invaded? 2 years, I suppose 3, soon, and I've done far worse, besides.
Leopold frowned, and cupped his fingers above his eye before staring up at the sky. The sun did not return his gaze, distant and bright as it was, but the winding light so far above seemed to be watching in silent judgment, all the same.
Confronting what your own actions possesses a peculiar aftertaste. I felt there would be more fear, more reaction, and yet. My greatest concerns at the moment are that I feel little besides the desire to run away, somewhere. Not unusual, but. Leo.
Mammon interrupted, voice deadly serious.
At the end of our lives, it's only up to us to judge ourselves, and others to think what they're gonna think. Until you've really asked yourself what that means, and tried to do the same for other folk, maybe make amends, you haven't really confronted anything. 2 coins.
Whatever had come over the demon left just as rapidly, but instead of the usual desire to lash out, Leopold couldn't help but keep staring into the sky. He was right, after all. But that was
sorry, but why is the air so damnably heavy, here?
And then, the tree line was flattened entirely, and the three were thrown along with them. Far above, Dragunov prowled the skies, eyes empty to all but a rival who would not appear, howling in anguish and madness and challenge, unanswered. Leopold reached for his cane to try to ease himself back up from the ground, and realized with some surprise that it wasn't at his side. Ah! There was no pain, at least, as Leopold removed it slowly from the mostly numb flesh it had lodged itself into. And even if he had felt anything at all beyond mind-numbing terror at the indefatigable beast that prowled the heavens above. Rising to his feet, Leopold shouted a challenge to the dragon, who did not hear it, long having since vanished from sight. But Leopold shouted again, and again until his voice was sore, and to no avail. Finally, the old man sunk into the ground, even as the trees refused to rise back as the grass had, earlier.
Boss, you shouldn't stress yourself, we just cleaned you up, aha.
Mammon was saying something, fidgeting at the wound, but it was dead flesh, it did not matter. Leopold's mind raced, and an old fire that had burnt since he was aware refused to die so easily.
One more. I'll take one more shot at this, and only the last. I promise you, both of you, I will not fail. And you need not stand with me, because I have made so many mistakes before, but I will not let anyone else down, I will not, I shall not.
His words sounded feverish even to him, but it had been his goading that had led that true witch to Dragunov, and though he had failed in both his goal and his ambitions, the task of dealing with that creature fell to him, for both, and for a third reason, perhaps. The skin of his knuckles felt tight and plastic against his bones, but at the same time he felt strong and alive, and perhaps, yes, perhaps this was for the best.
Leopold.
Crimsolino's tone was cold, and unlike Mammon, who was attempting to find the right thing to say and growing unnerved with his usual aversion to the harshness of things, Crimsolino thrived at such moments. And it made sense, for how many others could say they had seen the upheavals she had? But to thrive under this kind of terror was a wondrous thing. Still, her voice was like water that had been left to freeze in the dead of winter. Mammon grew less fidgety as he set about gauzing the flowing blood from the new wound of little consequence that Leopold's own cane had caused the old man, and Leopold listened, as hard as it was to think.
I will only say this once. I do not trust easily, almost at all, and I do not trust you, not fully. I cannot. But we have suffered and lost together, and that is not easily shaken off, do you understand me, so far?
His brow furrowed, Leopold gave a curt nod.
Then know this, pursuing that thing will only lead to more ruin, more moments where you stare at your hands and wonder what, exactly the point of your journey was. Even assuming you are not incinerated entirely, even assuming you were to somehow shackle Dragunov's will to your own, or whatever thought you may entertain.
And her eyes set on his and refused to move and to blink.
Will it bring you peace?
The three of them were silent once more, and the wind picked up again. Dust and light shone in the air, perhaps mixed with the cast-off gossamers of the insects from before. Leopold realized that his wound had been staunched, but of course it had been hard to feel the difference.
Ah! Thank you, Mammon. I suppose.
He shut his eyes. How many years of his life would that make this, then? How many lives, spent pursuing the same wasted goals? And with that, how much had been lost? Or, maybe, none of it was lost, and it had just been his foolhardiness that. Leopold's shoulders sagged, but he felt an odd sense of relief wash over him.
I do not think I would have noticed it, myself. Might have gotten infected or something like that. Would have been a terrible pain, trying to clean it afterwards.
Mammon tapped the side of his nose, knowingly.
Hey, well, better red-coated on the inside than empty because all your bloods flowed out from a gaping mahogany-accented wound. You really all right, Leo?
Was he?
I think I am.
Above, Leopold reflexively glanced for some sign left by Dragunov, some distant trail of light or dust, or perhaps just an area where the oxygen and sky itself had fled in abject fear, but there was none, and if it were not for the stillness around them, as terrible as any silence could be. Folding his arms and resting them on his cane, for there was no hard feelings against good hardwood, and it had done far more for him than it had against, Leopold managed to smile, just a bit.
Ah! Crimsolino, I do believe I also owe you a thank you, but I'm afraid I cannot do so yet. This isn't going to be easy for me, you know. And, I don't think I shall manage to reward either of you for having put up with my ambitions so far, ahaha.
It was a weak laugh, he knew. But, it was acceptable to have a weak laugh, even for a gentleman, if it gave your friends reason enough to smile.
Think nothing of it. I, personally, resolve to do most all tasks on my own power, and regardless. Some mere hedge infernalist like yourself probably couldn't have matched the sorceress strength of the Grand Witch who cursed me in the first place.
Crimsolino sniffed haughtily, and the gesture was almost as funny as the way she tried to cover her beak as she did, or how ridiculous she looked half-hopping along on the ground beside them. She was, after all, meant for the open sky and not to waddle along dragging a bustle of feathers against the ground. But it gave the illusion that the harpy was at his right and Mr. Mammon was at his left, and the sensation was not altogether unpleasant. No, Leopold decided that it was entirely good, even though comments questioning his magical prowess were not. Of course.
Dunno, Crim. Leo's a pretty surprising guy, though I kind of get the impression that the sort of magical battle that'd be would have turned out just leaving you double cursed. Think I've said as much before, but I mean. Double cursed. What part of that doesn't sound awful? Double. Oh, but Mammon. As scandalous as an ordinary curse may be, there's a line where scandal becomes intrigue, and as much as red might suit me, I'll risk even a triple crown curse if it might mean showing up vile curse crones that don't know well enough to keep to their lonesome.
Leopold smiled to himself, and shut his eyes. How many moments like this had he missed, then, just by looking past them, and not at them? Chapter end.